Hello and welcome back to Thecrimereel. Firstly, I would like to say a huge thank you to Amy Ferrell for suggesting this story. Amy has a very personal connection to this crime story, and I shall provide more details of her links to this case at the end of my narration. Today, we shall be looking at the life and crimes of Dorothea Puente. This has been a particularly difficult case to research as there is a great deal of conflicting information available, particularly about Dorothea's early life and marriages. The source of many of these differing stories seems to be the varied tales that Dorothea herself told over the years. I have tried to pull together the information as accurately as possible by using a large number of sources, but the definitive dates and numbers of marriages, births, divorces and deaths in the years leading up to the 1980s may be slightly different depending upon the source used. On January 9th, 1929, Dorothea Helen Gray was born in Redlands, California. It is believed that she was the sixth of 7 children born to Jessie Gray and Trudy Yates. Her parents worked as cotton pickers and her early years were extremely difficult. Both of her parents were alcoholics, and when Dorothea was 8 years old, her father died from tuberculosis. The following year, in 1938, Dorothea's mother died in a motorcycle accident. After her parents' deaths, Dorothea lived in a series of foster homes or with distant relatives and never experienced any stability in her life. Throughout her life, Dorothea invented different versions of her childhood years, claiming that she either had been born into poverty in Mexico and subsequently abandoned, or that she was the youngest of 18 children born to a large family in Mexico. In 1945, at the age of 16, Dorothea married a soldier by the name of Fred McFall. Fred was 22 years old and had just returned from his service during World War II. Within 2 years, Dorothea had given birth to their 2 daughters. One of them was sent to live with relatives in Sacramento, while the other was put up for adoption. Soon after, in 1948, Dorothea became pregnant for the 3rd time but suffered a miscarriage. Later that year, after just 3 years of marriage and 3 pregnancies, Fred left Dorothea. To avoid what she perceived as the humiliation of being left by her husband, Dorothea began telling a story that her husband had sadly died of a heart attack shortly after their wedding. At 19, with little education and no money, she started to forge cheques and within a year had received her first criminal conviction for this and ended up spending several months in prison. Some sources state that shortly after her release from prison, she became pregnant again by an unknown man and gave birth to her 3rd daughter, or possibly twin daughters, who were again put up for adoption. In 1952, Dorothea married Axel Johansson. Dorothea and Axel, who was originally from Sweden, met in San Francisco and were married after a relatively short courtship. They remained wed for 14 years, despite their marriage being particularly turbulent. During their relationship, it is reported that Dorothea suffered multiple miscarriages, gambled and drank heavily, as well as having affairs with other men. In 1960, Dorothea was arrested in a Sacramento brothel during a police raid, and despite claiming that she was simply visiting a friend, she was arrested for owning and managing a brothel and was sentenced to 90 days in Sacramento County Jail. Axel stood by her during this time, but 6 years later, their marriage was over. In the same year as her marriage to Axel ended, she married Mexican Roberto Puente. At the time of the marriage, Dorothea was 37 and Roberto was just 18 years old. The marriage was short-lived, with rumours that Roberto was purely interested in money and American citizenship. At some point in the late 1960s or early 1970s, Dorothea took over a 16-room care home in Sacramento, where she started to provide care for the homeless. She was very popular within the homeless community and also with the social workers in the district for providing care for those considered to be the toughest of cases: alcoholic, drug addicts, abusive tenants and the like. In 1976, Dorothea married for the 4th time. Her new husband, Pedro Montalvo, was a violent alcoholic and the marriage only lasted a few months. After their separation, Dorothea looked at new ways to make some money. She decided to visit local bars where she would build friendships with older men. Once these men were befriended, she would steal their benefit checks, forge their signatures and cash them. In the early 1980s, she also posed as a nurse and drugged patients in order to steal their jewellery and money. In 1981, Dorothea moved to 1426 F Street in downtown Sacramento, a quaint Victorian boarding house where she rented a room. In April 1982, a friend of Dorothea's, Ruth MONROE, was looking for a place to live. Ruth was a 61-year-old grandmother with a terminally ill husband in hospital care, and so she did not want to live alone. With the help of her sons, Ruth moved in with Dorothea on Easter Sunday, 11th of April 1982. Ruth's sons would visit her after work each day, and in the very beginning this arrangement seemed to be working well. However, her son was surprised to see Ruth with a drink in hand during one of his visits, as his mother had never previously drunk alcohol. A few days later, on the 27th of April 1982, he visited as usual, but found Ruth in bed unable to move or speak. Dorothea assured him that she was taking care of his mother, but the following morning he received a call saying that his mother had sadly died. An autopsy determined the cause of death as suicide by overdose, which was backed up by Dorothea's statement that Ruth had been very depressed over her terminally ill husband. Ruth's sons disputed this version of events, stating that their mother was not depressed and was coping well with the situation she was in. However, despite this, Ruth's death was still ruled as a suicide. Shortly afterwards, the police were once again called to 1426 F Street, this time because 4 elderly people had accused Dorothea of drugging them and stealing from them. When arrested, she was found with a ticket to Mexico in her handbag. It is assumed that with police closing in on her for her crimes, she had used the money she had stolen to plan her escape. However, in August of 1982, she was found guilty of the theft charges and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Despite Ruth's death just a couple of months earlier, no links were made between Ruth's death and these drugging crimes. During her time in prison, Dorothea started a pen pal relationship with a 77-year-old man from Oregon by the name of Everson Gilmuth. Due to her good behaviour, Dorothea was released in 1985 after serving just 3 years in prison. Upon her release, Everson was waiting to collect her in his red 1980 Ford pickup truck. Their relationship soon progressed, and it wasn't long before they had a joint bank account and had started to plan their wedding. Dorothea moved back to the boarding house at 1426 F Street, and when the current manager left, she moved to the second floor and started to manage the rest of the rooms in the house. Once again, she was popular with local social workers, providing accommodation for anyone, even the most difficult of people to place. During November 1985, Dorothea hired a handyman to install some wood panelling in the home. Once the handyman, Ishmael Flores, had completed the job, Dorothea paid him and also gave him a bonus, a red 1980 Ford pickup. Dorothea told Mr. Flores that the truck originally belonged to her boyfriend who had given it to her. She then asked Mr. Flores to complete another job, to build her a wooden box, 6 feet by 3 feet by 2 feet. She told him that she wanted to use it to hold some books and other items which she planned to move into storage. Once he had built the box, Dorothea filled it, nailed it shut, and the two of them loaded it onto the pickup truck and headed towards the storage unit. On the way there, Dorothea suddenly changed her mind, asking Mr. Flores to stop and dump the box on a riverbank in Sutter County, which many people used as an unofficial dumping site. Dorothea explained that she had been thinking about the contents of the box, and upon reflection had decided that they were just junk, so she wanted to dispose of them. Dorothea continued to run the boarding house. She took in many tenants over the years, all of whom were vulnerable in some way. Perhaps they were frail and elderly, or had drug or alcohol abuse problems, or they had no family or friends to look out for them. Many would stay for weeks at a time, while others would stay a day or two before moving on. In August 1986, Betty Palmer, a 77-year-old lady who lived at the boarding house, went to a doctor's appointment but was never seen at the boarding house again. In February 1987, another tenant, Leona Carpenter, who was 78, was discharged from hospital into Dorothea's care. 2 weeks later, Leona left and never returned. Then in July 1987, 62-year-old James Gallup, who had recently had an operation to remove a brain tumour, moved into the boarding house. He visited his doctor for a post-operative checkup and was never seen again. 62-year-old Vera Martin spent 2 days at the boarding house in October 1987 before leaving without a trace. None of these movements were particularly remarkable, as many people would arrive and leave from boarding houses in the area. During the late 1980s, Sacramento was experiencing an increase in homelessness, and none of these disappearances would feature on the radar of the authorities. While some tenants complained that Dorothea was mean and refused to give them their mail or money, others seemed to be very complimentary of Dorothea's kind nature, home-cooked meals and general compassion for those she housed. However, every month, Dorothea would collect the tenants' mail before they could see it, cash their social security checks, and give them only a small amount of their money to live on. Sometimes this money would be taken by the tenant to buy drugs or alcohol, where they would be picked up by police after an anonymous tip. In 1988, a street counsellor, Judy Moyes, was working with a homeless man by the name of Alberto Montoya, who was also known as Bert. Bert was a 51-year-old schizophrenic who required a place to live and someone to help take care of his medicines. Judy visited Dorothea, who happily agreed to Bert moving into her boarding house. Within weeks, Bert had improved beyond recognition. He was clean, neatly dressed, and regularly taking his medication, which allowed him to carry on conversations with those around him. Judy was incredibly impressed, and it would seem that Bert was thriving by the summer of 1988. However, things were about to change. By the autumn of 1988, Judy was unable to contact Bert and was told by Dorothea that he was visiting her brother, who was a doctor in Mexico. Dorothea assured Judy that he would be back within a few days. When Bert still hadn't returned several weeks later, Dorothea changed her story to say that one of Bert's relatives had come and taken him away while she was attending Mass. Judy's suspicions were raised due to this change in story, and she contacted the police. She spoke to an Officer Ewing and asked him to visit Dorothea to see if he could find out what was going on. Judy also advised the officer that a good person to speak to would be a boarder by the name of John Sharp. John was a kind man who did not drink or take drugs, and Judy was confident that John would talk honestly to the police. When Officer Ewing visited the house, he found Dorothea to be extremely accommodating and helpful, and John Sharp confirmed the story of a relative arriving to collect Bert. However, just as Officer Ewing was leaving, John followed him outside and secretly handed him a small note asking him to meet later at a location away from the house. At this meeting, John reported that Dorothea had told all of the boarding house residents to lie to the police and to tell them the story of relatives arriving for Bert. John also explained to Officer Ewing that he had noticed some very strange going-ons at the house. He could hear things being dragged downstairs late at night. There were often strange holes being dug in the garden, and a rancid smell was coming from the upstairs room. Officer Ewing referred this new information to his superior, Detective Sergeant John Cabrera. After some preliminary investigations into Dorothea, details of her criminal past came to light. John Cabrera also discovered that Dorothea was in her late 50s and not 70s as she claimed to be. With her white hair and no teeth, it would seem that Dorothea could pass as a much older lady. John Cabrera, along with a homicide detective by the name of Terry Brown and a parole officer, James Wilson, visited the house at 1426 F Street on the 11th of November 1988. When the three men arrived to talk to Dorothea, she was very calm and believable. She was sticking to the story that Bert had left with relatives. She allowed John Cabrera to have a look around the house, where he came across 2 pill bottles. One was full of blue pills, the other completely empty, both in the name of Dorothy Miller. When asked about these, Dorothea explained that Dorothy was a relative who had visited her and must have left them behind. John then asked if they could have a look in the garden, as they had received information that a body may have been buried there. Dorothea, while appearing shocked, showed no sign of alarm and allowed the police to dig in her garden, even offering the use of her shovel to assist them. Just under an hour later, the police officers found some fragments of 2 different types of fabric, what looked like some kind of clothing fabric, perhaps from a dress or a blouse, and some small leather-like pieces. The officers continued to dig but soon hit a tree root which stalled their progress. Unable to dislodge this with the shovels, John eventually stood in the hole to try to pull the root free. When it eventually came free, he was shocked to find that he was holding a human bone and not part of a tree. Dorothea gasped and appeared to be very shocked at this discovery. Soon a major police operation was underway. A canopy was erected in the garden to protect the area from rain. The coroner, forensic archaeologists, CSI, and more people arrived. It was discovered that the bone came from the body of an elderly female. By the following morning, news had spread and a huge crowd of neighbours and reporters had gathered. Whilst they continued to excavate the garden, Dorothea approached an officer to ask if she was under arrest, and when she was told that she was not, she asked if she could go to visit a nearby relative, as she was finding the whole ordeal very upsetting. At this point, the seemingly nice, helpful old lady had neither been arrested or considered a flight risk, and so was allowed to leave. About 20 minutes later, the police uncovered a second body and realised that Dorothea had fled. It would seem that she had realised that the police were very close to finding the second body, so she gained permission and simply walked away from the crime scene. Not long after, a third body wrapped in quilts, bedspreads and plastic sheeting was uncovered. The excavation continued and Dorothea's neighbours were interviewed. The police were informed of a day earlier in the year when a foul smell was coming from Dorothea's property, to the point that the neighbours could not use their air conditioning units. Dorothea was asked about this at the time and she apologised and said that she had been fertilising her garden. It was also noted that Dorothea would often get her boarders to complete DIY tasks around the house, which often involved digging holes in the gardens, although they were seemingly unaware what they were digging them for. The following day, 13th of November 1988, 2 more bodies were found on the property. These were again wrapped in cloths and plastic. On the 14th of November, police officers removed a shed in the back garden and uncovered another body. Once they finished searching the rear of the property, they completed a search of the small front garden. They found a 7th body, but this time the hands, feet and head had been removed, presumably to prevent identification. All 7 of the bodies were at various different stages of decomposition. Some may have only been buried for a few weeks, whilst others may have been there for years. The police now conducted a thorough search of Dorothea's house, which uncovered amongst other things a driving licence showing Dorothea's picture but with a different name, a book entitled Drugs and Their Effects, and a search of a small upstairs guest room revealed a rancid smell where it was later determined that bodily fluids had seeped into the carpet. Soon news of what was being discovered in downtown Sacramento had spread, and huge crowds of onlookers and worldwide media began to gather at the house on F Street. A nationwide hunt was underway for Dorothea. Police came under harsh criticism for how she was ever allowed to walk away from her house where a body had already been found. Identification of the victims proved to be a challenging task. Most of the bodies were too decomposed for fingerprints to be taken, and all but one of the bodies had no teeth. During the search, 24 adult human teeth had been uncovered in a neighbour's garden. When the autopsy was completed on the first victim that had been found, it was discovered that the small amounts of leather-like fabric found by John Cabrera were actually sections of petrified flesh. With little in the way of identification to go on, the police began looking into the social security records and benefits claimed for people living at the address. They found that benefit checks were still being cashed for Dorothy Miller, Vera Faye Martin, James Gallup, Fiona Carpenter and Betty Palmer, none of whom had lived at or been seen for over a year. With extensive media coverage, the police started to receive many leads as to Dorothea's whereabouts. One of these was from a man who contacted the Los Angeles Police Department, stating that he had spent an afternoon in a bar chatting to a woman who seemed to have an unusual interest in his receipt of Social Security benefits. With this new information in hand, the police tracked Dorothea to the Royal Viking Hotel in downtown LA, where she was arrested. Dorothea spoke openly about fraudulently cashing Social Security checks, but denied any involvement in any of the deaths. It is estimated that she was making over $5,000 per month from the money intended for her dead tenants. Coroners worked around the clock to try to identify the victims and causes of death. The 4th body that was found was the first to be identified because of 4 tattoos. It was 55-year-old Ben Fink, who had reportedly disappeared after going on a multi-day drinking spree. Then a positive identification of Bert Montoya was possible due to his remaining fingerprints. He had been found under a newly planted apricot tree. 64-year-old Dorothy Miller was identified by her dentures. Her arms had been duct taped to her chest. Eventually, the remaining victims were identified as James Gallup and Vera Faye Martin, who were both 62, 77-year-old Betty Palmer and 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, whose leg John Cabrera had mistaken for a tree root. As news of Dorothea's arrest became publicly known, police were contacted by the family of Everson Gilmuth, the man who had planned to marry Dorothea after her release from prison in 1985. Although his family had received letters from Dorothea telling them all about Everson and claiming that he was ill and so she was writing on his behalf, they had always had suspicions as to what was truly going on. At this point, it was possible to link Dorothea to the discovery of a man's body in a 6x3x2 box at the unofficial dump in Sutter County. The body had been found in 1986 and had never been formally identified. However, with this new information, police were able to determine that the body belonged to 77-year-old Everson Gilmuth. Additionally, the circumstances of Ruth Munroe's alleged suicide were revisited in light of these new discoveries. Dorothea Puente was charged with the murder of the 7 victims found buried in her garden, along with the murder of Everson and Ruth. After numerous delays and a change of venue, over 4 years after the victims were found, Dorothea's trial started in Monterey County in February 1993. The prosecution produced over 150 witnesses and 3,000 exhibits to try to prove her guilt, despite no one having directly witnessed any crime. And, in the majority of cases, there was no clear cause of death being established. The defence team agreed that Dorothea was responsible for the stolen benefits and also had buried the bodies in her garden. However, they argued that all of these people, who were either elderly or suffering from some form of illness, had died of natural causes. Dorothea did not testify. On July 15, 1993, the jury began their deliberations. It took 43 days before, on the afternoon of 26th of August 1993, they had reached a verdict. At the time, this was the longest jury deliberation in Californian history. Dorothea Helen Puente was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Ben Fink and Dorothy Miller. She was also found guilty of the second-degree murder of Leona Carpenter. On the charge of murder of the other 4 victims found in Dorothea's garden, the jury could not reach a unanimous verdict. 11 found her guilty, while 1 remained adamant that she was not guilty. A mistrial was declared on these charges. For the charges of the murder of Everson Gilmuth and Ruth Munroe, the jury were evenly split, and again a mistrial was declared on these charges. On the 13th of October 1993, Dorothea received 2 sentences of life without parole, and a further sentence of 25 years to life. In further interviews given during her time in prison, Dorothea always maintained her innocence and repeatedly stated that she had no concern for what people thought of her. During these interviews, she often contradicted herself and was proven to be a compulsive liar. Dorothea died from natural causes while in prison in Chowchilla, California on the 27th of March 2011. She was 82. Many of the news reports surrounding this case centred on the fact that Dorothea always chose her victims carefully, many referring to them as shadow people, because they either had no family or their family had given up on them. This perhaps allowed her to get away with her crimes for so long because there was no one to report these people missing. However, for at least one of her victims, this was not the case. As mentioned in my introduction, I was contacted by Amy Ferrell as she has a very personal connection to this case. When Amy was young, she lived in Malakoff, Texas, with her parents and her paternal grandmother, a lady in her 60s by the name of Dorothy Miller. Dorothy was an alcoholic and, in Amy's words, a handful for sure, but lived with Amy's family as she was unable to take care of herself. However, Amy's parents eventually had to place Dorothy in an assisted living facility as their living arrangement was becoming impossible to deal with. Dorothy had become violent towards Amy's brother and sister, so it had become unsafe for them all to continue to live together. The family continued to support Dorothy while she lived in the facility in Texas, but Dorothy upped and left. Dorothy's family looked for her and tried to find out where she had gone, but without any luck. It is now assumed that Dorothy hitchhiked to California before eventually ending up staying in Dorothea's boarding house. The next the family heard of Dorothy was when Amy was 12 years old, and her father was contacted by Sacramento Police Department to say that Dorothy's body had been found wrapped in plastic and duct tape buried in Dorothea's garden. The family believed that she was poisoned by arsenic being added to her brandy. As an adult, Amy has spent a great deal of time researching the details of this case and also providing a face to her grandmother, who had a family who cared about her despite their difficult relationship. Amy's son, Dorothy's great-grandson Jacob, has also been kind enough to provide a sketch that he drew of his great-grandmother. A massive thank you to Amy for providing all of this information and a different perspective of one of the victims in this horrendous crime. May Dorothy, Bert, Ben, Leona, Vera, James, Betty, Everson and Ruth rest in peace. That concludes the story of Dorothea Puente. Thank you so much for listening to that story. If you have any comments, please add them down below. I'd just like to also say hello to some friends in Waconia. Hi and hello to you guys. Thanks very much for listening to the Crime Reel. Goodbye. Psst. Ellie Greaves, I'm glad you're alive and well. Thanks for being so understanding in the last message. And happy 37th birthday, Rosewater. Happy birthday to you. On the 29th of Feb 2020, I did the latest draw to win a script. Lisa Fisher, you've won. Please can you contact me via email, thecrimereel@gmail.com. Also, as a reserve, I drew out one extra ticket, just in case I don't hear from Lisa. And so Sarah F, you are on standby. Thanks once again for listening to the Crime Reel. Goodbye.